The morning air in Wellington Estate was thick with the soft fragrance of blooming roses, and the golden sunlight danced gently on the spotless marble floors that reflected every inch of the grandeur around. It was the kind of house that made visitors whisper, not because they were told to be quiet, but because the sheer elegance of the place demanded silence. To Emma Collins, however, this silence had become the rhythm of her life. She moved through the long hallways with the quiet precision of someone who had memorized every sound her footsteps could make, every creak that needed to be avoided. 3 years she had worked there, scrubbing floors so clean that the chandeliers reflected on them like mirrors, arranging flowers that were never meant to be touched, and ensuring perfection for people who barely noticed her presence. At 24, she had learned that sometimes being invisible was the only way to survive in a world built for the rich. Her mornings began before dawn, her body waking instinctively to the sound of the first delivery truck that arrived at the estate gates. By the time the household stirred, Emma had already polished the main hall, set the breakfast table, and replaced the fresh linens in the guest rooms. The Wellington Estate was not just a house. It was a symbol of legacy and power, owned by a family whose name echoed in the corridors of the city's business world. Victoria Wellington, the matriarch, was a woman who spoke with the authority of someone who had never been refused anything in her life. Her late husband, Charles Wellington, had built an empire in real estate, and their son Julian was expected to carry the torch forward. Emma knew little about Julian at first. For months after his return from abroad, she only caught glimpses: a shadow crossing the staircase, the sound of expensive shoes on marble, the low murmur of his voice behind closed doors. The staff whispered stories about him, stories that painted him as both tragic and mysterious. He was the man who had lost his wife in a sailing accident 3 years ago, a loss that had turned him into a recluse, rarely smiling, rarely speaking to anyone, and burying himself in work that seemed to offer no comfort. Emma had no reason to think their worlds would ever collide. She was a maid. He was a millionaire. Their lives were not meant to intersect, except in the small moments when she would quietly place his coffee on the table or dust the bookshelves in his study while he worked. But sometimes life doesn't ask permission before rearranging destinies. It begins quietly, in the simplest of moments, like that rainy afternoon when Emma found him sitting in the library, his gaze fixed on the window as the rain poured outside. She remembered the sound of it, soft, rhythmic, and oddly comforting. She had entered silently, her dusting cloth in hand, when his voice broke the quiet. "You can stay," he said, not turning to look at her. "The silence is worse when I'm alone." She froze for a second, uncertain if she'd heard correctly. Servants were not supposed to linger in the same room as the family unless asked directly. But his tone wasn't commanding. It was weary, the voice of a man who carried too many thoughts and no one to share them with. So she stayed, continuing her work as the rain streaked down the window. Minutes passed before he spoke again. "Do you ever feel," he said slowly, "like you're living a life that isn't yours? Like every decision you make was already written by someone else?" Emma hesitated. It was not a question a maid expected from her employer. She looked at him, really looked, and saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before: loneliness, deep and sharp like a wound that refused to heal. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "but maybe that's what life is. We all follow paths others set for us, until one day, we decide to walk our own." He turned to her then, as if her words had touched something hidden beneath his polished exterior. From that moment, something changed. Their paths began to cross more often, at first by coincidence, then by choice. He would ask for coffee and wait for her to bring it, though he had never done so before. Sometimes she would find him standing near the gardens where she worked, pretending to admire the flowers while asking her small questions about her day, her life, her dreams. And slowly the invisible wall between the millionaire and the maid began to crumble. Emma found herself drawn to his gentleness, the way he listened, the way he seemed genuinely curious about her life. He didn't treat her like a servant. He treated her like a person, something few people in that house had ever done. And Julian, he found in her a quiet strength that he didn't know he had been searching for. She spoke of resilience, of finding beauty in struggle, of simple joys that money could never buy. Her laughter reminded him of a world that was warm and real, far away from the cold perfection of Wellington Estate. As the days passed, the house seemed to change too. The walls that once echoed with silence now held the faint hum of life again. The staff noticed that Julian smiled more often. Even his mother, Victoria, commented that her son seemed to be recovering. But she never guessed the reason behind his transformation. The late-night conversations in the library, the quiet walks in the garden, the laughter that echoed softly through the halls when she wasn't listening. For Emma, it was dangerous territory. She knew that love between them was impossible, that the distance between their worlds was a canyon that no bridge could safely cross. But the heart has its own logic, and love, once it finds its way in, refuses to leave quietly. She began to see Julian not as the wealthy heir, but as the man who had lost everything that mattered and was trying to find his way back. And Julian saw Emma not as a maid, but as a mirror of everything he admired: courage, honesty, kindness. The turning point came one evening, when the estate hosted one of Victoria's lavish garden parties. The lawn sparkled with fairy lights, laughter filled the air, and the guests, politicians, businessmen, and socialites, moved through the evening like actors in a perfectly rehearsed play. Emma had worked since dawn, managing the catering and ensuring every glass shone, every plate was placed just right. When her duties were done, she stepped into the garden for a brief breath of fresh air. That's when she heard his voice behind her. "Hiding?" Julian said, his tone light but weary. She turned, startled, then smiled faintly. "Just catching my breath, sir." He shook his head. "Julian. I told you, it's Julian." They talked quietly in the dim light hidden from the party. He confessed how trapped he felt by his mother's expectations, how every woman she introduced him to felt like another chain binding him to a life he didn't want. Emma listened, her heart aching with empathy. "You have everything," she said softly. "Money, success, freedom." "No," he replied, looking at her with intensity. "I have everything except peace." The words hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. And when he reached for her hand, the touch was electric, a moment so small yet powerful enough to change the course of both their lives. Emma felt her heart tremble, caught between fear and longing. She knew she should pull away, that the world they lived in would never forgive what was happening. But when he whispered, "You make me feel alive again," her resistance broke like glass. That night, as the lights of the party flickered in the distance, they shared a kiss, gentle, hesitant, but filled with every unspoken emotion they had buried for months. It was the beginning of something both beautiful and dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and their stolen moments became the heartbeat of their lives. They met secretly, sometimes in the library after everyone had gone to bed, sometimes in the old greenhouse behind the gardens. Every conversation deepened their bond. Every smile carried the weight of forbidden love. Julian began dreaming of a future that defied society's rules. Emma began to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could overcome wealth and status. But love stories in houses like Wellington rarely end without a storm. Victoria soon noticed subtle changes: the way her son's eyes softened when Emma entered a room, the sudden warmth in his voice when he spoke of the staff. Suspicion bloomed in her mind like a poison flower, and though Emma didn't know it yet, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Because sometimes, destiny doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply arrives, dressed as love, carrying both hope and heartbreak in the same breath. The days that followed that fateful kiss beneath the garden lights unfolded like pages from a dream neither of them had dared to imagine. Julian and Emma began to live within stolen hours, their moments together hidden between the ticking seconds of the grand clocks that ruled Wellington Estate. By day, she continued her duties with the same quiet precision, her uniform crisp, her expression neutral, while inside her heart bloomed with a warmth she had never known before. By night, when the house was asleep and moonlight bathed the marble corridors, she would find him waiting in the library or the conservatory, where shadows played upon the glass and silence held its breath around them. They talked about everything: their pasts, their fears, their dreams. And sometimes they talked about nothing at all, sitting side by side in a peace so rare that it felt sacred. Emma had never believed herself capable of such happiness. To be loved by the heir of the Wellington fortune was not something she had ever sought. And yet when Julian looked at her, she did not feel like a servant. She felt like an equal, like a soul recognized and seen. Julian had changed since the day she first found him staring at the rain. The grief that once wrapped around him like a shroud had begun to loosen its grip. He smiled more, laughed quietly when she teased him, and even began to venture into the gardens again, finding beauty where once there had only been ghosts. The staff noticed, whispering to one another that the young master was finally healing, though none of them guessed the reason behind it. Only Emma knew how deeply the transformation ran, how he would wake in the night drenched in sweat from dreams of his late wife's accident, how he would sit by the window and confess that he feared happiness because he no longer believed he deserved it. She listened, offering comfort not with grand words but with presence, and through that presence he found the courage to begin living again. But love that grows in secrecy also grows in danger. Victoria Wellington, ever vigilant and ever controlling, began to sense something was shifting beyond her reach. Her son's moods had improved, but his sudden refusal to entertain her plans, the dinners with powerful families, the introductions to wealthy heiresses, made her suspicious. She watched him closely, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, searching for the source of his distraction. It was one afternoon while Emma was dusting the grand staircase that Victoria's gaze lingered on her for a second too long. "You've been here quite a while, haven't you, Miss Collins?" she asked in a voice that was honeyed yet cold. Emma bowed her head slightly. "Almost 3 years, ma'am." "Loyal service," Victoria murmured, her smile thin. "Loyalty is a rare quality, but one must always remember one's place. In this house, boundaries matter." Emma nodded silently, her heart thudding because she understood what the older woman was really saying. "I see something you think I do not. Be careful." Despite the threat that hovered unspoken in every corner, Emma and Julian continued to meet. They couldn't stop. Their hearts had become addicted to the quiet truth they found in one another. They dreamed of leaving, of finding a small home by the sea where no one cared who they were. But those were only dreams whispered between midnight and dawn. Reality, as always, waited like a shadow at the edge of happiness. It was during those uncertain weeks that Emma began to feel the first signs. A dizziness in the mornings, a fluttering unease that grew into realization. She counted the days, her hands trembling as she did, and when the truth became undeniable, she sat on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters and cried silently, her mind spinning with both fear and wonder. She was carrying his child. When she finally told Julian, she expected panic, perhaps even denial. Instead, he stood in stunned silence for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms with a tenderness that broke her. "A baby," he whispered against her hair, his voice shaking. "Emma, we're going to have a baby." She wept against his chest, whispering that it would ruin them both, that his mother would never allow it, that she could lose everything. But he only tightened his embrace and said, "We'll figure it out. I'm done hiding from life. I love you and I'll stand by you." For a few fleeting days she let herself believe it. They spoke of names, of small futures, of freedom. Julian promised to tell his mother and make her understand. She begged him to wait, to think, but he was determined. "She needs to hear it from me," he said. "I want her to know I'm not ashamed." That conversation shattered everything. Victoria's rage echoed through the halls of Wellington Estate like thunder. Servants scattered, afraid to be caught in the storm. The words she hurled at her son were sharp enough to wound the walls themselves: disgrace, betrayal, madness. She accused Emma of manipulation, of trapping her son to climb above her station, of poisoning the family's name. When Julian defended Emma, Victoria turned her cruelty on him with surgical precision. She reminded him of the empire built in his name, of the board members who would turn against him if rumors spread, of the fortune that could vanish with a single decision. She painted visions of poverty and ridicule until even Julian's defiance began to waver. When he came to Emma that evening, he looked like a man torn apart. She saw it immediately in the guilt, the conflict, the breaking. "She said she would cut me off," he whispered. "She said she would destroy us both. I told her I didn't care, but Emma, if she pulls the funding, the company will fall. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. It's not just about me anymore." Emma stared at him, realizing that fear had already begun to win. "And what about me?" she asked softly. "What about our child?" He took a step forward, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "We could wait," he said weakly. "Until things settle, maybe we shouldn't." The unfinished words hung between them like smoke. She felt them strike her chest like a blade. "Say it," she whispered. "Say what you're afraid to." Julian closed his eyes. Maybe it's better if we don't have the baby, not now. It's not the right time. For a moment the world stopped turning. The man who had once spoken of forever now spoke of convenience. The silence stretched until she finally said, her voice breaking yet steady, "I see. You would rather lose your soul than your comfort." He reached for her, begging, but she stepped back. "You told me happiness was what you were searching for. You said I made you feel alive, but you never wanted life, only escape. I will not be your escape, Julian. I will be my child's home." Her words hit him harder than any slap could. She walked away, leaving him standing alone in the same garden where it had all begun, surrounded by roses that no longer smelled of love but of loss. That night Emma packed her few belongings. Her tears falling soundlessly on the linens she had once folded for others, she left before dawn, carrying nothing but her courage and the life growing within her. As the bus rolled away from Wellington Estate, she pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered, "We'll be all right." Behind her, the estate loomed like a monument to everything she was leaving behind: wealth, illusion, and a man who had been too afraid to choose her. For Julian, the days that followed were hollow. He woke each morning expecting to see her face in the corridors, to hear her soft footsteps in the hall. Instead, there was only silence, the same suffocating silence that had once defined his existence before she came. He tried to work, but numbers blurred. He tried to sleep, but dreams tormented him. His mother believed the storm had passed, proud that she had saved the family name. But Julian knew better. He had not saved anything. He had destroyed the only thing worth keeping. He often found himself in the library, staring at the chair where she used to sit, hearing echoes of her laughter. The glass of whiskey on the table remained untouched now. He no longer needed it to feel broken. He had become his father's son, powerful, wealthy, and utterly empty. And far away, in a small town lit by humble street lamps, Emma began a new chapter. Her aunt's bakery became her world, the scent of flour and sugar, the warmth of the ovens, the steady rhythm of honest work. Each night she would rest her hand on her growing belly and whisper to her unborn child about courage, about dignity, about never letting the world decide your worth. She missed him, God, she missed him, but love that costs your soul is not love worth keeping. She had chosen strength over sorrow. What neither of them knew was that time, the quiet sculptor of fate, was already shaping a path that would one day force them to face everything they had run from, their choices, their regrets, and the truth of what it really means to love. The morning light fell softly across the quiet streets of Riverside, where Emma Collins had built a modest, humble life for herself after leaving Wellington Estate behind. The air smelled faintly of baked bread from her Aunt Pauline's bakery, and the small town moved at a pace that made the world seem gentler. But no amount of peaceful mornings or the kindness of strangers could erase the memories that clung to Emma's heart. Every time she looked at the growing curve of her stomach, she was reminded of a love that had started like a whisper and ended like a storm. It had been 3 months since she'd left the estate. 3 months since she had last seen Julian Wellington, the man who had promised her the world, but had surrendered to fear. There were nights she lay awake, wondering if he ever thought of her, wondering if he missed her, wondering if he had fought harder after she walked away. But deep down, she already knew the answer. She had seen the hesitation in his eyes that night. The weight of wealth and family had been too heavy, and love had simply not been enough to carry it. Her Aunt Pauline had welcomed her with open arms and without questions. She had always been a woman who understood life's cruel unpredictability. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," she had told Emma when she arrived that night with a single suitcase and swollen eyes. "You only owe yourself a second chance." Pauline's bakery became both a refuge and a new beginning for Emma. Each morning, the smell of dough, sugar, and coffee filled the small shop, wrapping her in a kind of warmth she hadn't felt in years. The regular customers came to know her gentle smile, her patience, and her quiet strength. Slowly, Emma began to find herself again, piece by piece, like a broken vase being lovingly repaired by time and will. But as her pregnancy progressed, so did her worries. She didn't have much money saved. The wages she had earned at Wellington Estate had barely been enough to survive. And while Pauline refused to take rent, Emma couldn't let her aunt carry all the burden. She started taking on extra work, helping at a small tailoring shop in the evenings, folding and pressing clothes while her baby kicked softly inside her. She didn't complain. Every coin she earned, every hour she worked, felt like a promise to her unborn child. A promise that they would never feel unloved, never feel abandoned. Sometimes, when she walked home under the streetlights, she would talk softly to her belly, telling stories about bravery, kindness, and hope. "You're not alone," she would whisper. "You have me, and I'll never let you down." Meanwhile, far away in the marble corridors of Wellington Estate, Julian Wellington's life had become a silent war. He had done what his mother demanded. He had ended things with Emma. He had watched her leave, his heart shattering in the process, and since then nothing had felt real. The parties, the meetings, the perfectly dressed social appearances, all of it had turned into noise that he couldn't escape. His mother believed she had won, that she had rescued him from scandal, but what she didn't see was that in saving her reputation, she had broken her son. He went through the motions of life mechanically, like a ghost trapped in his own home. Even the company board began to notice his distraction. The spark that had once made him a visionary businessman was gone. Every night, he sat in the same library where he had first spoken to Emma, staring at the empty chair she used to dust, hearing her voice in the silence. He thought about her strength, her laughter, the wisdom in her words. Happiness isn't about what you have. It's about what you make of what you have. He realized now that she had been right all along. All his wealth, all his influence couldn't buy him peace. He had chosen security over love, comfort over courage, and now he had neither. Sometimes he would imagine her somewhere far away, living a better life, maybe even forgetting him. But the thought of her forgetting hurt more than anything else. He had loved her truly, but he had loved himself too little to fight for her. Victoria noticed her son's growing silence, but she mistook it for maturity. "You're finally becoming practical," she would say during their morning tea, her diamond earrings catching the sunlight. "You'll thank me one day, Julian. You'll see that love fades, but legacy endures." He would nod politely, saying nothing. He knew she would never understand. Love wasn't her language. Power was. The house that once felt like a monument to success now felt like a prison, built out of expectations and guilt. And though he didn't know it yet, the consequences of his choice were about to find their way back to him. Back in Riverside, the months turned quietly into seasons. Emma gave birth on a crisp winter morning, snow falling gently outside the small hospital window. The pain had been unbearable, but when she heard the first cry of her child, it was as if the entire world stood still. A tiny baby boy, pink and fragile, lay in her arms, his eyes blinking up at her as though he already knew her. She named him Ethan after her father, a man who had taught her what strength meant long before life tested her. Holding him, she realized that love didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. It didn't need wealth, titles, or approval. It only needed truth. Ethan became the center of Emma's world. Every morning she woke to his laughter, his little hands reaching for her, his smile reminding her that even broken stories can create beautiful new beginnings. She worked harder than ever, waking before dawn to bake with Pauline, then sewing dresses during Ethan's naps. Some days exhaustion pressed against her bones, but every time she looked into her son's eyes, she found new strength. She no longer dreamed of luxury or escape. She dreamed of giving Ethan the kind of life where love was enough. Years began to pass quietly. The boy grew, his laughter filling the small house like music. Emma taught him to read, to draw, to see beauty in simplicity. People in town admired her, the young mother who had faced the world with nothing but determination. She became known for her kindness, for the way she never complained, and for the way she always helped others despite her own struggles. Riverside had embraced her as one of their own, but fate has a strange way of circling back, of reopening doors we thought were long closed. It happened one spring morning, almost 5 years after Emma had left Wellington Estate. Julian was attending a charity event in Riverside, a new housing project his company was sponsoring for low-income families. It was supposed to be just another public appearance, another opportunity to polish his image. He hadn't expected anything unusual, but as he walked through the small community center, greeting people and shaking hands, his eyes caught sight of a woman standing by the refreshment table, helping a group of children with crafts. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair tied back, her movements graceful and familiar. His breath caught. It couldn't be, and yet it was. Emma. For a moment the world tilted. Time seemed to fold back on itself, carrying him to that night in the garden, to the laughter, the promises, the pain. She looked different now, and stronger, more grounded, but her eyes, those same deep brown eyes, carried the same quiet fire. And beside her, holding her hand, was a little boy with dark hair and the unmistakable green eyes of a Wellington. Julian's chest tightened as realization hit him like a wave. His son, the son he had never met, he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Every regret he had buried came rushing back with brutal clarity. He had spent years pretending to live, chasing success, but in that moment he understood how empty his victories truly were. The life he had thrown away was standing right in front of him, a woman who had once loved him with everything she had, and a child who carried his blood but not his name. Emma noticed him then. Their eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with everything that had been left unsaid. He took a hesitant step forward, but she stood still, her face calm but unreadable. Julian saw the flicker of recognition, followed by the guarded strength of a woman who had learned to protect her peace. She didn't run, but she didn't move closer either. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but words felt meaningless compared to the truth standing before him. It wasn't until Ethan tugged gently at Emma's hand and looked up that the moment broke. "Mama," the boy said softly, "who is that man?" Emma's lips trembled for a second, and she gently placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "Just someone from long ago," she whispered. Then turning back to Julian, she gave a faint, polite nod, the kind of nod one gives to a stranger. And with that, she turned and walked away. Julian stood there, rooted to the floor, his heart splitting between guilt and longing. He wanted to run after her, to fall to his knees, to beg for forgiveness. But something stopped him, the realization that he didn't deserve it, not yet. He had made his choices, and now he would have to earn the right to even speak to her again. That night, as he sat in his car overlooking the quiet town, Julian finally wept. Not the silent tears of regret he had shed before, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the soul of a man who had finally seen the cost of his cowardice. He understood now that money could build empires but could never buy back moments, never buy back trust, never buy back love once it had been betrayed. He vowed that night to change, not for her forgiveness, not even for redemption, but because he wanted to be the kind of man his son could one day be proud of. The following weeks after that unexpected encounter in Riverside were the most restless of Julian Wellington's life. Every waking hour seemed to echo with the sound of his own choices, each regret striking like the toll of a bell that would not stop ringing. He could no longer look in the mirror without seeing the hollow man staring back at him, the reflection of someone who had once been admired by the world, but loathed himself in silence. All the years he had spent building wealth and status felt meaningless now that he had come face to face with what he had lost. The image of Emma standing in that community center, her posture strong, her expression composed, her eyes filled with quiet fire, haunted him like a memory that refused to fade. And the boy beside her, their son, his son, whose small hand clutched hers with the same natural trust that he himself had forfeited, remained fixed in his mind. For the first time in years, Julian felt something real coursing through his veins again. Guilt, yes, but also longing, and the faint, painful spark of hope that maybe redemption was still possible. He spent days trying to summon the courage to reach out to her. But how does a man knock on the door of the past he destroyed? How does he ask forgiveness from someone he had once left standing in the ashes of love? It wasn't as simple as an apology. It never was. Apologies are easy. Change is hard. And so Julian began where he should have begun long ago, with change. He stopped letting his mother dictate his life. For years he had obeyed Victoria Wellington's cold, calculated vision, mistaking her dominance for protection. But now he began to push back. When she demanded that he attend another business banquet, he declined. When she criticized his lack of focus, he quietly informed her that the company would survive without him for a while. For the first time in his life, he started saying no, and it shocked her. "What's gotten into you, Julian?" Victoria had asked one morning as they sat across from each other in the grand breakfast room. "You're behaving like a man possessed. This sudden independence, and it's not becoming of a Wellington." Julian's calmness unnerved her more than anger would have. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm finally becoming the man I should have been years ago." Her perfectly painted lips tightened into a thin line. "You're being sentimental again," she hissed. That maid from years ago, she's the reason, isn't she? You're letting that foolishness ruin you again. Julian looked at her for a long moment, realizing that he no longer felt the need to argue or justify himself. You call it foolishness, he said, standing up, but it's the only thing that's ever made me feel human. He left the house that morning with a strange clarity. The man who had once bowed to wealth and reputation was gone, replaced by someone who had finally learned that dignity is not found in money, but in truth. He began to visit Riverside quietly, at first only observing from a distance. He saw Emma walking Ethan to school, holding his hand, her face glowing with the simple joy of motherhood. He watched her work in the bakery, laughing with customers, kneading dough with the same care she once used to polish marble floors. She looked alive, fulfilled, and stronger than ever, and yet there was a small ache in her eyes that only someone who had truly loved her could recognize. He didn't approach her right away. He didn't want to intrude or cause pain. Instead, he focused on proving to himself that he could stand as his own man before ever asking to stand beside her again. He began funding quiet charitable initiatives in Riverside, rebuilding the old playground, repairing the school library, supporting single mothers in need, all anonymously. It wasn't guilt that drove him. It was understanding. He had spent too long taking. Now he wanted to give. The more time he spent in that small town, the more he realized how much of life he had missed in his pursuit of grandeur. The laughter of children playing, the hum of daily life, the simplicity of honest work. These were the things that made life worth living. And he had traded them all for an empty mansion filled with regrets. Months passed before he finally gathered the courage to speak to her again. It was a cool autumn afternoon, the trees painted with shades of amber and gold, when he saw her leaving the bakery carrying a basket of bread. He approached quietly, his heart thundering. When she turned and saw him, she froze for a brief second before her expression settled into polite composure. "Julian," she said, his name tasting like an echo of another life. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, searching for words that could carry the weight of years. "I didn't expect you to forgive me," he said softly. "I just wanted to see you, to tell you that I'm sorry, not for what happened, but for what I became." Emma's face remained unreadable. "You don't owe me explanations," she said. "We've both built our lives now." "You've built something beautiful," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "And I destroyed something beautiful. I don't expect anything, Emma. I just needed to say I was wrong. About everything. About you. About love. About what truly matters." She looked at him then, her eyes steady, her expression calm but distant. "Regret doesn't change the past, Julian. And forgiveness doesn't erase the pain. You made your choice and I made mine." He nodded slowly, accepting her words like a penance. "I know. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you meant that day. When you said happiness isn't about what you have, it's about what you make of what you have. I had everything and I made nothing. You had nothing and you built a whole world." For the first time, Emma's eyes softened slightly. There was no anger left in her, only the quiet wisdom that comes from survival. "You don't have to punish yourself forever," she said gently. "We all fall. What matters is whether we rise differently." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both pain and gratitude. "I'm trying," he whispered. "Not for me, but for him. For Ethan." Her body stiffened slightly at the mention of their son's name. "He doesn't know you," she said. "He doesn't need to. He has love. He has stability. I don't want to take that from him," Julian said quickly. "I just want to earn the right to know him someday when you think it's right. When he's ready. When you're ready." Emma looked at him long and hard, searching for deceit, for pity, for weakness, but found none. The man standing before her was not the broken heir she had once known. His posture was humbler, his tone gentler, his eyes clearer. There was no arrogance, no entitlement, only the quiet sincerity of a man who had been remade by remorse. She finally exhaled slowly and nodded once. "Change takes time," she said simply. "Show me that it's real, Julian. Not through words, but through what you do." And that was all he needed to hear. From that day on, Julian began to rebuild not just his life, but his soul. He moved to Riverside permanently, buying a small house instead of a mansion. He joined local projects, working with his own hands instead of simply signing checks. People were surprised to see a man of his wealth kneeling to repair a broken bench or helping to repaint a school wall, but Julian didn't care. He found joy in labor, in simplicity, in humanity. Slowly, Emma began to see him around. Not as the millionaire she once served, but as a man trying to serve others. And though she remained cautious, she couldn't deny the quiet respect growing inside her. Ethan, curious and friendly, soon began to notice him too. One afternoon, the boy saw Julian fixing the swing at the park and ran over. "Mister, you're doing it wrong," Ethan said with childish confidence, making Julian laugh genuinely for the first time in years. "Then maybe you should show me how it's done," Julian replied. From that day, a fragile, innocent friendship began. They played chess at the park, built paper airplanes, and talked about stars and dreams. Julian never told Ethan who he was. He didn't want to steal that truth from Emma. But every time the boy smiled, Julian felt both blessed and punished by the purity of it. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Emma began to see the truth. Julian wasn't chasing redemption for show. He wasn't trying to win her back with words or wealth. He was living differently. She saw him stay late at the community center fixing broken furniture, saw him help an elderly neighbor carry groceries, saw him treat her son with gentle patience. And though her heart had long been taught not to trust easily, something within her began to soften. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Riverside, painting the sky in shades of gold, Emma watched Julian and Ethan laughing together from her bakery window. She stood there silently, hands dusted with flour, her heart heavy yet strangely light. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a world where forgiveness didn't mean weakness, where healing didn't mean forgetting. Maybe, she thought, people truly could change, not through promises, but through pain and effort and the humility to begin again. That night, when she put Ethan to bed, he asked her softly, "Mama, that man at the park, and why does he always look at you like that? Like he's sad but happy too?" Emma smiled faintly, brushing her son's hair back from his forehead. "Because," she said quietly, "sometimes people spend their whole lives learning what really matters, and when they finally understand, they see the world differently." The boy blinked sleepily. "Is he a good man?" he asked. Emma hesitated, her heart full of memories, and some bitter, some beautiful. "He's trying to be," she said finally, "and sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do." The winter that settled over Riverside that year carried a gentler kind of cold. The air was crisp but not cruel, the mornings bright with soft sunlight that melted the frost on rooftops. Inside the bakery, the scent of vanilla and warm bread wrapped around the customers like an embrace. And behind the counter, Emma moved with calm purpose, her apron dusted with flour, her hair pinned loosely as always. Life had found its rhythm again, but it was no longer the rhythm of survival. It had become one of quiet peace. Years of struggle had shaped her into a woman whose strength was steady, not loud, whose dignity came from perseverance rather than pride. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there lingered something unspoken, a faint tremor in her heart that awakened whenever she caught sight of Julian across the street, laughing with Ethan, or helping a neighbor fix a roof. Time had not erased the memories between them, but it had softened them, reshaping pain into reflection. She did not deny that he had changed. She simply did not know if she could trust the part of her heart that once believed in him. Julian, meanwhile, had built a new life piece by piece, with the same patience one uses to rebuild a broken home. He had left behind the towering walls of Wellington Estate, choosing instead a modest house near the river, where mornings began with the chirping of birds rather than the echo of servants' footsteps. The business empire he once ruled now ran without his constant control. He had stepped back from the board, keeping only enough to fund the charity projects he truly believed in. Each day he found satisfaction not in profits but in purpose, restoring playgrounds, mentoring young workers, sponsoring education programs for children who might otherwise have been forgotten. People who once viewed him as an aloof millionaire began to see him as a man of integrity. Yet all his outward transformation could not quiet the ache that lived within him. The ache of a father watching his son from a distance, of a man whose redemption still lacked the one thing that made it complete: forgiveness from the woman who had taught him what love truly meant. Ethan, now 7 years old, had grown into a bright, inquisitive child with a quick smile and 1,000 questions. He adored his mother but had formed an unspoken attachment to the man everyone in town knew simply as Mr. Julian. Their bond had deepened naturally, through shared laughter at the park, through the stories Julian told about the stars and ships and courage, through the small lessons about kindness that he slipped into every conversation. Emma had watched all this with careful eyes, never intervening, never discouraging it either. She saw the way her son's face lit up when he spotted Julian, and the way Julian's entire being seemed to soften when Ethan ran toward him. It was a connection born of something deeper than explanation, a silent truth that neither of them yet knew but both somehow felt. One Sunday afternoon, the town organized a small community fair to celebrate the completion of the new school library, a project Julian had personally overseen. The square was alive with music and laughter. Children ran with balloons, families shared food, and the air was filled with the warm hum of togetherness. Emma had set up a small bakery stall, her pastries arranged neatly on wooden trays. Ethan darted between the stalls, his excitement uncontainable. Julian was there too, helping the volunteers distribute gifts to the children. For a while, Emma watched him from a distance, observing the way he interacted, humble, patient, content. There was no trace of the man who once measured worth in status. He was simply human now, and in that simple humanity lay the proof she had been waiting for. As evening settled and fairy lights flickered to life, a sudden commotion broke near the edge of the square. A stray dog, startled by the fireworks, had knocked over a stand, and in the confusion, Ethan, chasing after a dropped balloon, slipped near the curb just as a delivery van turned the corner. The scream that tore from Emma's throat was pure instinct, but before she could move, Julian was already there. He lunged forward, pulling Ethan out of the van's path, the vehicle screeching to a halt mere inches away. The crowd gasped. Time froze for a breathless moment. Emma ran to them, heart hammering, and found her son trembling but safe in Julian's arms. The boy's face was streaked with tears, but his voice was steady when he whispered, "You saved me." Julian's eyes glistened as he held him tighter. "You're the bravest boy I've ever met," he said softly, his voice breaking. Emma knelt beside them, her hands shaking as she touched Ethan's face. For a long moment, all three of them stayed like that in the past, the present, and the fragile possibility of a future converging in a single heartbeat. That night, after the fair ended and Ethan had fallen asleep, Emma found Julian standing by the river, the moonlight reflecting off the water. She approached quietly, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only witness to what hung between them. He turned when he sensed her, his expression calm but his eyes filled with emotion. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said quietly. "I just couldn't let anything happen to him." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her voice trembling when she spoke. "You didn't just save him today. You saved a part of me I didn't know was still alive, the part that believed people could change." Julian exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. "Emma," he began, his voice rough with sincerity, "I spent so long trying to build something the world would admire, but everything I built turned to dust the moment I lost you. I've spent these years learning to be a man my son could be proud of, not a man the world applauds. I don't ask you to forget. I don't even ask you to forgive me for the pain I caused. I just want you to know that everything I do now, every step I take, is because of the lesson you gave me when you walked away." She felt tears sting her eyes, but they were not the bitter kind. They were warm, human, cleansing. "You hurt me deeply," she said softly, "but I see you now. Not the man I once loved, not the man I once lost, but the man you have become, and maybe that's enough." Julian's voice faltered. "If you ever let me, I'd like to be part of his life, even if it's only as a friend. I just want him to know the truth one day, not to think his father was a coward who disappeared." Emma took a step closer, her expression gentle. "He already knows you, Julian. He just doesn't know your name. And when the time is right, I'll tell him. But when I do, I want to tell him that his father didn't just come back. He became better." Silence stretched between them, not heavy, but peaceful. The river shimmered in the moonlight, carrying their reflections away like memories finally set free. Julian looked at her then, really looked, and in her eyes he saw not judgment but understanding. Tentatively she reached out her hand. For a moment he hesitated, afraid that touching her would break the fragile spell. But then their fingers met, and in that simple gesture lay all the forgiveness words could never express. It wasn't the passionate embrace of lovers reunited. It was something purer, the quiet meeting of two souls who had walked through fire and found peace on the other side. Weeks later, on a bright spring morning, Julian visited the bakery just as the sun rose. Ethan sat at a corner table drawing with crayons while Emma arranged pastries in the display. When the boy looked up and saw Julian, his face lit up with the easy joy of childhood. "Mr. Julian, come see what I made," he called out. Julian smiled, walking over as the boy proudly showed him a crayon drawing, 3 figures holding hands under a blue sky. "That's you," Ethan explained, pointing, "and that's Mama, and that's me." The simplicity of it struck Julian harder than any speech could have. He felt his throat tighten as he crouched down beside the boy. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Ethan beamed. "Mama says families aren't just who you live with. They're who love you. So I drew us all together." For a moment, Julian couldn't speak. His vision blurred, his heart swelled, and then, unable to hold it back any longer, he cried. Not the tears of guilt that had once haunted him, but tears of release, of gratitude, of a man finally allowed to feel whole again. He pulled Ethan gently into his arms, his voice shaking. "Thank you," he murmured, "for letting me be part of your world." Emma stood a few feet away, watching quietly. The sight of Julian holding their son, both smiling through tears, filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but something far more real. The ending of wounds and the beginning of healing. She stepped closer, laying a gentle hand on Julian's shoulder. "He's got your eyes," she said softly. Julian looked up, his tears glistening in the morning light. "And your heart," he replied. From that day forward, the rhythm of their lives blended like two melodies that had finally found harmony. Julian became part of Ethan's world, not as a hero, but as a father learning every day what love required. Emma found herself rediscovering laughter she thought she had lost. They did not rush back into love. They let it grow slowly, quietly, like sunlight filtering through leaves, patient and pure. Together they built something far greater than wealth, a family grounded in forgiveness, humility, and grace. And sometimes when the sun set over Riverside and the sky blazed gold, Julian would sit beside Emma and watch Ethan chase fireflies across the yard. He would take her hand and whisper, "I used to think happiness was something you could build out of marble and gold, but now I know. It's built out of second chances." And she would smile, leaning her head on his shoulder as their son's laughter echoed through the twilight. Proof that even the most broken hearts can learn to beat again when touched by forgiveness.